Affect and stereotype application. In general, the cognitive moderators just discussed appear to confer greater importance to the activated stereotypical concepts in social judgment by undermining more evidence-based processing of the stimulus field. The impact of stereotypes on judgment and memory is also exacerbated by certain emotional states. For a review, see Bodenhausen et al. 2001. Initially, this work focused on valence-based mood effects in which the focal comparisons were on the differential effects of negative versus neutral versus positive affective states. An implicit assumption of this approach was the notion that different types of affect within a particular valence, for example, anger, sadness, and fear, produce functionally equivalent effects. Intuitively, one might expect to find that negative moods of any sort would be likely to promote greater use of negative stereotypes, whereas positive moods would have the opposite tendency. These common sense intuitions, however, have proved to be incorrect. In general, positive moods appear to increase reliance on heuristics and generic knowledge structures. For example, Bless et al., 1996a. Eason and Daudman, 1984. Eason and Means, 1983. Otaki et al. 1997, Schwartz et al. 1991, Worth and McKee 1987. In contrast, sadness seemed to be associated with the avoidance or minimization of the use of heuristics, schemas, and other simplified processing strategies. For example, Bless et al. 1990, Weary and Gannon 1996. These findings clearly imply that happiness will likely be associated with greater reliance on stereotypes, whereas sadness may be associated with reduced reliance on them. Much evidence supports this expectation. In general, category information has been found to exert a stronger effect on the judgments of happy than sad or neutral perceivers in several studies. For example, Abele et al. 1998, Bless et al. 1996c, Blessum et al. 1998. Bodenhausen et al. 1994a reported several experiments in which individuals in a positive mood were more likely than their neutral mood counterparts to judge individual targets in ways that were stereotypic of their social groups. Park and Banerjee, 2000, showed that happy people are less likely to discriminate accurately among different members of a stereotyped group. Instead, they tend to set a lower threshold for drawing stereotypical conclusions and hence are more likely to remember incorrectly that specific group members possess stereotypical traits. The fact that positive moods can increase perceivers' reliance on simplistic social stereotypes seems fairly counterintuitive. Closer examination of the relationship between happiness and stereotyping, however, has provided some insight into these findings. Schwartz, 1990, and Schwartz and Bless, 1991, proposed that happy moods signal that everything is fine and that there is little need for careful analysis of the environment. Consequently, happy perceivers may generally prefer to conserve their mental resources rather than engaging in systematic thinking. This line of argument gains some support from evidence that the superficial forms of thinking observed among happy people can be readily eliminated when the situation provides other bases for effortful processing, such as relevance to personal outcomes. Forgas, 1989, accountability to a third party, Bodenhausen et al. 1994a, or task demands, Martin et al. 1993. Relatedly, Bless and colleagues, Bless and Fiedler, 1995, Bless et al. 1996A, 1996B, 1996C suggested that happy perceivers are often content to rely on their general knowledge and to use it as a basis for constructive elaboration. Fiedler et al. 1991. But that they are reluctant to do so if it proves to be inadequate to make sense of the target. For example, when the available individuating information is unambiguously counter-stereotypical, Bless et al. 1996C. Greater stereotype application under conditions of positive effect has thus been attributed to distraction, a general lack of epistemic motivation, and a generally greater confidence in generic knowledge structures. Happy people are generally neither unwilling nor unable to engage in systematic thinking. Rather, happy people appear to be flexible in their information processing strategies. Although often content to rely on efficient, simplified bases for judgment, such as stereotypes, they are quite capable of engaging in more detail-oriented processing if personally involved or otherwise motivated for more systematic thinking, or if simplified processing fails to provide a satisfactory basis for judgment. With respect to sadness, there is less evidence, but the available studies are generally consistent with the idea that sad perceivers do not rely on generic knowledge. For example, Edwards and Weary, 1993. Bodenhausen et al., 1994a, for example, demonstrated that sad participants did not differ from neutral participants in their tendency to rely on stereotypes. Park and Bernagi, 2000, found that sad participants were similar to neutral mood participants in their sensitivity in distinguishing among category members, and that they set a more stringent threshold for drawing stereotypic conclusions than did neutral mood controls. Complementing their functional analysis of happy moods, Schwartz 1990 and Schwartz and Bless 1991 argued that sad moods suggest to perceivers that their environment is problematic and thereby promote more detail-oriented, careful thinking. Research by Lambert et al. 1997 shows that the fact that sad perceivers are less likely to rely on stereotypes is attributable to their tendency to engage in stereotype correction. Drawing on Schwartz's 1990 analysis, Lambert et al. Argued that sadness should induce perceivers to scrutinize the use of stereotypes in the judgment process. Specifically, they assumed that sad perceivers should use stereotypes only in cases in which their use seemed appropriate to the judgment. They found, for example, that sad perceivers were more likely than controls to correct for negative but not positive stereotypes. Presumably, positive stereotypes were not considered an inappropriate basis for judgment. This kind of finding is consistent with the general idea that sad perceivers are likely to be careful, systematic thinkers. For example, Schwartz, 1990, Weary, 1990, applying stereotypes only when it seems appropriate to do so. Otherwise, they seem to take pains to avoid letting such biases influence their judgments. Importantly, the effects for sadness do not generalize to other negative moods. Compared to neutral mood controls, heightened stereotyping has been observed among both angry, Bodenhausen et al. 1994a, Keltner et al. 1993, and anxious, Barron et al. 1992, Raghunathan and Pham 1999 individuals, presumably because the accompanying arousal levels interfere with processing capacity. In addition to the role of cognitive and affective moderators of stereotype application, a variety of motivational states also seem to be important. It is fairly well established that epistemic motivation undermines the use of stereotypes. holding perceivers accountable for their judgments, for example, Bodenhausen et al. 1994a, placing perceivers in a position of independence with or dependence on the target, for example, Fisker and Desprez, 1996, and making the judgment personally relevant or important to the perceiver, for example, Kruglanski and Freund, 1983. Also motivate perceivers to invest more effort in the judgmental process and lead to less stereotypical judgments. Causal uncertainty appears to have similar effects, Weary et al. 2001, as does experiencing a loss of control, Pittman and D'Agostino, 1989, and holding non-prejudiced attitudes, Wire, 2004. In contrast, other motivational states, such as prescriptive norms, Gill, 2004, prejudice, Hugenberg and Bodenhausen, 2003, Kawakami et al. 2002, and the need for ego defense serve to enhance the use of stereotypes in judgment. Sinclair and Kunda, 2000, for example, demonstrated that participants viewed women as less competent than men after receiving negative but not positive evaluations from them, suggesting that participants' motivation to protect their self-views led them to use an available stereotype that they would not have used in the absence of this motivation. For similar arguments, see also Fine and Spencer, 1997, Spencer et al., 1998. Social judgeability concerns also moderate stereotype application. Unless perceivers believe there is a legitimate informational basis for a stereotypical judgment, whether or not such a basis exists, they are unlikely to report category-based, that is, stereotypic, assessments. When the only information that is available to perceivers is the target's category membership, or when the additional non-categorical information is deemed irrelevant to the judgment, perceivers are reluctant to rely on stereotypes. When additional pseudo-relevant or subjectively individuating information is available, however, perceivers do allow stereotypic information to contribute to their judgments. Thus, perceivers render more stereotypical judgments only to the extent that their stereotypes are not perceived as being the main source of information for the judgments, and to the extent that they feel entitled to judge the target. For example, Ezerbeit et al., 1994, 1997, 1998. Finally, implicit theories of personality influence stereotype application. People who hold an entity theory of human nature and believe that traits are fixed and enduring are more likely to render stereotypical judgments than are people who hold an incremental theory and believe that traits are malleable. Levi and Dweck, 1999, Levi et al., 1998, see Bastian and Haslam, 2006, for an alternative perspective. Theories about particular stereotypes also have implications for the construal of social information. In 3 studies, Wittenbrink et al., 1997, see also Wittenbrink et al., 1998, demonstrated that specific causal assumptions about the underlying socioeconomic disadvantage among African Americans, as either personal or structural, influenced participants' construal of causality in a situation that involved a Black target, and that interfering with participants' ability to integrate the available information into a coherent representation on encoding reduced substantially the stereotyping effects. In a trial simulation, ascriptions of personal, rather than structural, causality of Black disadvantage led to more guilty verdicts, longer sentencing recommendations, and more stereotypical trait ratings of the Black defendant, but only when participants were able to integrate the presented information.
Smooth moderator. narrator.